Ooh. Okay, so what have we gone through? Like 51 games so far. Let's take a quick intermission here. Let's talk about a peripheral, since we've used it for the last 2 games, and it's something that would have made the list if it qualified. Let's talk about the Super Game Boy. The Super Game Boy was a revelation. People might not appreciate this today, but playing Game Boy games at home back in the day meant that you had a gray brick with a tiny screen that you could hardly see in your hands. This was the best thing going. And you better have the right lighting for it. Most of us didn't have the worm lights that existed. I think like we all knew one rich kid with it. But you knew the right spot in your house that worked best. There's no way to play at night outside of right underneath that spot, of course. And you had to kind of tilt it just right even in the car, which is like the main point of the Game Boy back then. Even with the right light in the right spot in your house, then you had to have 4 AA batteries, and your parents got mad at you if you kept taking them out of the remote control. So you had to keep finding them somehow. The battery life was good on Game Boy, but it wasn't infinite. You couldn't just plug it in and charge it like you can do with the handhelds today. You couldn't just drive up to Kogo's to get yourself some more batteries back then either, because you were like, 7 years old. So you have a small library of Game Boy games, but no real way to play them conveniently at home. You had to pretty much save your Game Boy battery for road trips. So that's why the Super Game Boy was such a big deal. So now you're styling and profiling, you're playing games on your tiny TV in the bedroom, but with a Super Nintendo controller. So suddenly you basically had more Super Nintendo games, especially with the later Game Boy games like Donkey Kong Land that were that good too. So you went from being able to play these games sometimes and having to, be kind of cognizant of battery and like this is something you want to play on road trips when you need it, to like I can just play Super Mario Land 2 whenever I want to. And like games like Super Mario Land 2 were better than a lot of Super Nintendo games and played even better in your TV. And then there are games like Tetris and Dr. Mario, which were effectively now about as good as their previous console versions. And other games like NBA Jam were not quite as good, but you could play it on your TV. So the Super Game Boy was cool for a bunch of other reasons too. You could change color palettes, borders, button schemes, which is invaluable for the Super Nintendo because Y and B are the most convenient buttons pretty easily, but by default it's like A and B on the controller that you have to use. Then there are games like Pokemon and Donkey Kong, which we just looked at, which really took advantage of the Super Game Boy to do things like add colors or sound effects that you couldn't do on the standard Game Boy. So, if nothing else, I wanted to kind of give you the idea that the Super Game Boy wasn't just like kind of a cool, like, oh, that's neat, you can do that now, which today, a lot of that utility is lost because you have so many ways to play games portably, or, you can just play them at home easily too, with a lot of options that I'm sure you know about. But back then, those things did not exist, and you had to be careful playing those Game Boy games because you needed that battery. So the Super Game Boy was a big part of my childhood, maybe even the reason I finished as many Game Boy games as I did, because it gave you that ability to play Game Boy games at home. I hope that kind of illustrates what kind of a problem it solved and why it was actually really useful at the time, even though I know today not quite the same utility. So anyway, let's give it up for the Super Game Boy. Number 59, Super Smash Bros. Brawl. This is maybe the most anticipated game I ever had. I was a college freshman, got the game on the day spring break either started or the day before it started, but then I stayed up all night playing it and had no classes the next day, so either way, I was decently responsible about it. It was a lot of fun, maybe not the system seller I had expected it would be when I camped out for a Wii, but a worthy update in the Super Smash Bros. Franchise. You know Super Smash Bros. Of course, you fight 3 opponents, hopefully your friends, try to knock them off a ledge with crazier items and even Mario Kart. In this game, the CDs, and then changing and tweaking the music selections in the stages were among my favorite features. Really like the coolest thing that you didn't know you needed in a game. It was just something that added a ton of fun to it. It was really something I was disappointed was missing from Smash Bros. For 3DS. I like to use King DDD And not so much because I liked the way King DDD plays, but because he looked like a basketball player on our college campus. So, I mean, we thought so anyway. So we would yell a version of his name mixed with King DDD while we were playing the game. And basically, you would just yell this. Anyway, this is obvious, but this was a really fun game to play in the frat house. But there are never enough GameCube controllers to go around, and so the Wii setup was always utilized at least somewhat. Someone had to use the Wii controller and a nunchuck, and that's not ideal for Smash. It's actually what I'm using while I play here, and it gets the job done. I'm going to do okay in this one. The addition of Sonic the Hedgehog was a long time coming to the series and a perfect fit. Snake maybe didn't make quite as much sense, but this was, at the time, a definite upgrade of a roster. Pokemon Trainer was also a really cool addition. Maybe, again, a little bit of a disappointment when you think about the high hopes I had for it, but absolutely a worthy game to be here. Number 58, Tecmo Super Bowl III. So I think initially this game wasn't even in the top 100 for me. We're talking years and years ago when I first started putting together the formula for this list. That was a massive oversight, and as I realized, hey, I'm still playing this game, and I'm playing an awful lot of this game, it did begin to creep up into the territory it belongs to. So I got more into 16-bit gaming again after the SNES Classic came out, and this was really just one of the beneficiaries of it. It's the best football game for my favorite NFL season ever, the 1995-96 season, which ended with my Steelers losing the Super Bowl to the Dallas Cowboys, or maybe Neil O'Donnell losing the Super Bowl to the Dallas Cowboys. I did make a video about this once. It's over an hour long. It shows everything you can do in this game, and I've played every single game in a 3-season burst, which won every single game in that, and won the Super Bowl all 3 times with my Steelers, and I unlocked NFL legends you can get in free agency. Now, the thing I want to kind of defend myself with on this is that when I initially posted that video about Tecmo Super Bowl III, someone made a comment saying that, don't listen to me. He's saying you should never, or the Steelers are the best team if you get Barry Sanders. And I think what I said was something along the lines of, you should not lose a game if you do this. And you shouldn't. The side-scrolling view from Tecmo's Super Bowl returns. The feel, though, is less arcade and more simulation. It was definitely starting to move toward realism, and gaming in general was moving more towards realism at that time, too. It wasn't always about having the most fun and best adaptation of a sport. It was about getting as close to the sport as you can, which is still kind of something I think it suffers from today. The fun here still does outshine the realism. It's just a little bit too tilted in that direction for me. This was the last great Tecmo Super Bowl game, although a DS reboot had me overly excited until, unfortunately, I actually played it. Number 57, Pikmin. So I got Pikmin shortly after the GameCube launched, if I remember the timeline correctly here. Like, was this within a few months, maybe? Anyway, it didn't click for me as a kid, and it was the one GameCube game I ever sold. So, as an adult, I regretted this, wanted to give it another shot, so I got a used copy, and it absolutely blew me away. This is exactly the kind of game you need a little more patience to fall in love with, and as a kid, patience is not always your strong suit. Another thing about hindsight, I guess, is a lot of people talk about how great the GameCube was, which has the benefit of looking back and not missing out on all the exclusives the other consoles got. But Pikmin, I think, is one of those games people are talking about, especially when they talk about the early GameCube being great. You're going to use the Pikmin as tools to fight enemies, perform tasks, and collect objects to escape a planet, all within a 30-day time limit. And the time limit is probably part of the experience that I didn't like when I was a kid, but I can't imagine playing the game without it now. This is something they got rid of in Pikmin 2, but did bring back in Pikmin 3 to some extent. It's now been about 20 years. There's effectively 3 Pikmin games. I think there's a handheld one as well, which, unfortunately though, these games just got more complex as time went on. And I think this one, as the best one, shows that you can do just fine with 3 types of Pikmin and 1 person guiding them. So I'd like to see them upgrade the amount of maps and the amount of puzzles rather than upping the complexity if there's ever a Pikmin 4, because Pikmin's first outing, this one, was a genuine classic. Number 56, Super Smash Bros. For 3DS. I never had a Wii U, so this Super Smash Bros. Game was the sequel to Brawl for me. It's terrific, as are all of the Super Smash Bros. Games I've ever played. The controls now unconditionally to 3DS pad, which feels great compared to the Wii's occasional remote control option you'd get, or get forced with, whenever you played with friends. And in a cool twist, you could even use it to play the Wii U version when you played with a friend who had that game. I had the chance to do that a couple of times, and it went really well. Hyrule Castle, my second favorite Smash stage ever, finally made a return in this one, although the GOAT stage is still Saffron City, and at least for the Smash Bros. Games I've played, still waiting for that one to show up. It wasn't a pure upgrade though. We lost some characters, had to pay for DLC of others, and the CDs with my music, which was one of my favorite parts of Brawl, were gone from this version. It does still edge out Brawl, but it began to feel that for all the time it took to make a Smash game, they seemingly weren't getting much better. That's not to say that this isn't a fantastic entry, just that from an upgrade standpoint, it didn't really jump forward the way I think we all hoped. Number 55, Super Mario Bros. 2. So when I started making this countdown and writing the script, I had a space in here about how this was the one main series Mario 2D game I'd never beaten. I'd gotten awfully close, but anyway, after a lot of trying, blood, sweat, tears, what have you, after a lot of that, about 1 week ago, I finally climbed to the top of this particular mountain, and can now say I've gotten through all of them. So that's, obviously, that's what I've got going for me this week, which is nice. With the exception of the lost levels, which I'm sorry, I'm just not willing to count. We all know the story here and how this actually interacts with the lost levels. This is a localized version of a Japanese game called Doki Doki Panic that we got instead of the real Super Mario Bros. 2. But Americans have it good, and we got easily the superior game. This was actually a point in game development where you didn't expect the sequel to be exactly the same as the original. You think Castlevania 2 is nothing like Castlevania, Legend of Zelda 2 is not like Legend of Zelda, and Super Mario Bros. 2, not like Super Mario Bros. In America. So you have 4 characters to work with here. Explore left to right, but also now up and down. This game has some vertical platforming. There's keys, there's new interesting boss battles along with some Mario touches we know and love. Musical cues, mushrooms, coins. You could have really made most any platformer after Super Mario Bros. A sequel, since everything after it owes so much to it. But this one actually does feel very natural, and obviously we happen to get a great game as the reskinned selection, which was perfect, and bring back Wart. Number 54, Pokémon Snap. A photography game certainly sounds weird, but effectively this plays as a first-person rail shooter where you get a higher score for better shots than your target. But like that, it makes a lot more sense. And that game sounds like it could be fun. So once you add in the fun Pokemon characters, some cool secrets, and a lot of different ways to unlock hidden levels, you have a great game that finally has gotten a well-deserved sequel that unfortunately I haven't played yet. Pokémon Snap is also one of the games that actually follows the anime closest if you're into that as a kid, and it's a game I bought quickly after the N64 was past its peak, remembering the good times I had with it as a kid. It goes for some crazy prices nowadays, just another example of things really going insane, but back then it was like $3. Nostalgia plays a huge role in these games for me, and I think this one has some of its best years ahead of it, because I can see myself taking pictures of Pokemon with my child or my nephews someday. Number 53, Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time. Speaking of time, I'm going to take my time with this one. So when I was a kid, there were a lot of conversations about the best game of all time. And I imagine there still are now, but I bet there's debates about the best game too. And that's an important distinction. Because when I was a kid, there weren't debates about the best game of all time. There were only conversations because the best game of all time was The Legend of Zelda, Ocarina of Time, hard stop. I always wonder how this game is received today since I'm no longer really plugged in. Clearly, when you look at my list, I don't consider it to be the best game of all time, and the obvious question you'd be asking is, what caused it to fall so far for me? When you've probably noticed I didn't play a lot of games that happened more than a decade after Ocarina of Time. And that obvious question is wrong, because for me the game rose up all the way to number 53. It didn't fall. Ocarina of Time was always critically acclaimed, but it was actually a frustrating game for me as a kid, and at one point was actually one of my least favorite games because of that. I did get back at it as an adult. I'm going to say an adult is probably like a old teen, and over a period of years, I came back to it again and again until I finally completed the game, and I remember that moment well. At that point, I was able to recognize that the game's world has some kind of allure to it that makes it impossible to really dislike, even if at one point I finished the Water Temple and walked away for like a few years. And since then I've realized this game has always kind of been one I just carry with me. It has some kind of presence to it. And I think this is actually a really good opportunity to describe part of my theory of why video games are good. You can play a video game repeatedly over years. I mean, I never really stopped playing Ocarina of Time, and there are two reasons for it. One is replay value, and that's the amount of things and modes there are in a game to complete. And one is simply gaming magnetism, the way a video game can draw you back to it again and again. And I think when this works best, it's because of an interesting world that you like exploring and being a part of. Hyrule on the N64 is, quite possibly, the most magnetic world ever created. And over the years, I appreciated that more and more and more, even if the Zelda formula, as we talked about way back on game like number 86, was never really my favorite thing. So, here's what at one point was considered the best game ever made by virtually everyone. For me, it's topped out. This is the most I've ever liked it, at number 53, but it may continue to climb higher as I appreciate the world it created more and more. Back then, something tells me it just wasn't just the gameplay or the dungeon design that people liked and reviewed so well, but that strange magnetism the game has to it, the way Hyrule draws you in. Maybe everyone else just noticed that first, or experienced it first. Games are still being made, and they're bigger, and they're more detailed, but nothing brings you back to it the way Ocarina of Time does, which makes me wonder just what the secret sauce really was, and why it's still so fresh today. Amazing to visit, but not my favorite to actually complete. That's the paradox I have with Ocarina of Time, and that's why a self-professed retro gamer has it all the way at number 53. Number 52, Wii Sports. Somewhere, some Zelda fan just screamed. And look, I get it. Wii Sports is a tech demo and not a work of art. And whenever I'm talking about what makes a game good in terms of magnetism or replay, that really does apply, but probably mostly to single-player games. You can have a ton of fun with Wii Sports, especially with other people. What a tech demo it is. You know, I once got a hole in one in Wii Golf, and I care about it so much that I just said so on the internet. It might actually go on my gaming achievements Mount Rushmore. When the Wii came out, this game came as a pack-in game, and I got it along with Twilight Princess. Now, I wouldn't say I ignored Twilight Princess, but I can't honestly say I've gotten past the first dungeon either. So Wii Sports was the one that commanded all of my attention back then, and even now. I've gone back to try to play Twilight Princess a couple of times since, and just never has hooked me. Wii Sports was the game that I got the Wii with. It isn't a deep game, but it is a purely fun experience. Number 51, Risk. And at 51, we have a board game, right? Well, kind of. Risk included an arcade mode that added some skill with a D-pad into the mix, and finally let you have a fighting chance against a much bigger army. While I was playing this one, I won a 6 versus 1 battle. And Risk itself is one of my favorite board games to play, but without a video game version, it sure takes a lot of time and effort to do it. This is therefore the ideal way. Whenever I was thinking about what games weren't on a Genesis Classic, Genesis Mini, and should have been, this was one of the first games I thought of. Weirdly, when we were in college too, we turned this into a little bit of a drinking game. I don't remember how, and maybe that's part of how successful it was. It's Risk, and the thing is, this is all done mathematically. Again, I'm plugging numbers in and getting a formula. But I think this is appropriate that Risk is a board game and it's at number 51, because really should a video game adaptation of a board game be in the top 50? And I think maybe not when you're thinking about video games as an art form being what you're ranking here. It doesn't make a lot of sense to have a board game in the top 50, have a board game pretty exalted in terms of levels. So this is the ideal spot that, the best video game adaptation of a board game should be at, number 51. So while it was accidental, I think it's really appropriate that this is the highest it gets, and you're not going to see Clue, Battleship, or Monopoly up any higher ahead. Risk on Genesis is the best board game adaptation of a video game ever. And now we've reached the top 50. But this is not as big of a deal as you might hope for. While the top 50 means something from a milestone point of view, in terms of pure numbers, the next actual division comes at number 33, when the games become bronze games. That is, games within 3 full numeric points of being a perfect score, based on the formula I use here. So yes, number 50 is going to be better than number 51, but from a sheer Pantheon perspective, we've got a few more games to climb past before we hit that first plateau. Number 50, Resident Evil 3. So Resident Evil 3, in development, started out as a side story game for the series, but wound up being too good not to put a numeral on. It builds on the idea of Mr. X in the Beast scenario for Resident Evil 2, as well as the intense opening in Resident Evil 2 city area, and then it builds a whole game around it. It also dispenses with having 2 different ways to play the game, which was actually a huge negative move for the series. You can kind of see how this was a side game initially when you notice that, hey, it doesn't have the 2 characters, 2 story system, but then again, this kind of died after Resident Evil 2 for some reason. Maybe it was better to have one story to focus on, and I'm sure someone feels that way, but I always appreciated the 2 character dynamic in the previous 2 games. So Resident Evil 3 uses Raccoon City as its backdrop instead of a police station or a mansion. This is maybe the best part of Resident Evil 2, the outdoor area that you start off with, but instead of kicking off with a bang like Resident Evil 2 did in that map, Resident Evil 3's map never really comes together the same way Resident Evil 2's did. It starts you off in a city, and eventually you do go to a couple different locations. You'll actually revisit the police station pretty early on, but it doesn't exactly get the same quality map that Resident Evil 2 did have. Resident Evil 3 does have some upgrades though, in that there's some dynamic choices in this game where you have to make a choice quickly, and depending on how fast you make the choice or which choice you make, an outcome will be better or worse. This was a great idea, and I don't think they really went to the full potential of it, but it was something that was really cool, and you can kind of see traces of it when Resident Evil 4 did the quick time events. You want to try this one on any system you can get it out on. We're playing the Gamecube version here. It's a great way to play it. Also, it's 1 disc, which is great, but I also have this on the Dreamcast, and that version might actually be the best way to play it. And the Mercenaries mode you can unlock is a great touch, even if it's sort of a prototype for the awesome mode it would later develop into.